I'm Hal Ginsberg, and I'm really happy to have you joining me, Barry Lynn. Thank you so much for being part of Halitics.
Happy to do it. I've always been a fan of your radio presence.
Well, that's a real compliment, Barry, coming from you. You've a long record, of course, long history in media as well. And as the former executive director of Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, you carry a lot of weight in progressive circles, and deservedly so. What are you doing now that you're in retirement? And that's kind of a softball question leading right up to something for you to promote.
Absolutely. Well, during COVID, I decided there were a limited number of places you could walk in the woods and a number of streaming services that you can watch. So I thought maybe I should write a memoir. So I did. It's a trilogy. It's called Paid to Piss People Off. Originally, I was going to call it Fellowship of the Rings. Then somebody said, wait, some other guy wrote that book. But I found a little independent publisher in the Midwest called Blue Cedar Press. They were very interested in publishing this. And Paid to Piss People Off has created certain dilemmas because the word piss has made it difficult to advertise the book, because even the great free speech zealot Elon Musk would not accept payment up for an advertisement, $20, because of the word piss. Now, the word piss, of course, does have a kind of sordid history, because it's one of the 7 dirty words that got comedian George Carlin arrested back in 1972 as one of the words you couldn't say on television. But I thought we had moved perhaps beyond that, but not. And then one of the people who was writing a little review of this for Barnes and Noble couldn't write it without putting blanks in, paid to blank people off. And,
wow, I mean, I didn't think that would be. Don't they say that on TV now, Barry?
Apparently, no. You don't say it on TV much. I mean, it's but what's weird about it is a commonly used phrase. And I would think that we had gotten beyond having conniptions over the use of that word. Some of his other 7 dirty words, I wouldn't use. But this one, I thought, it came from a high school student who came up to me at a party when we were living in Virginia, or in Maryland. And he said, Mr. Lynn, I want to do what you do when I get out of school. And I said, Connor, what is it you think I do? And he looked at me and he said, I think you get paid to piss people off. And all of my work in the peace movement, in the anti-censorship movement, and in the separation of church and state movement, I wanted to write it down, in part because I wanted to be able to remember and have, relatives, friends, and purchasers of these books have a chance to look at. I was surprised, frankly, that so many people who know things like the amnesty movement for Vietnam War resistors, but didn't know very key things that they say, learned from reading book number 1 on peace. And I think that I wish more people would write memoirs. More people would talk about what it was that made a difference in their lives. I mean, I start the book with 5 people that made all the difference in the world. Everybody from, the first guy who hired me in Washington, D.C., who initially didn't even want to interview me, all the way to Attorney General Ramsey Clark, who became a good friend of mine. And
I'll tell you, your title made me envious, Barry, because I have pissed a lot of people off, and I've never gotten paid for it. I really felt, how come, Barry, what's the secret sauce that got you this success, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I do think a lot of people have said that, and I think that is a more honorable thing, arguably, to do. But I think one of the things I like to tell people, including young people who are thinking about being activists, is you can, in fact, make a career and even make a little money out of taking the issues you care about the most and preaching about them, so to speak, to anybody who will listen. And so these are the 3 books. And if you go to my website, you can find ways to buy them.
And you got the link right there on the screen. It's also
There it is.
in the description of the program. When you buy Paid to Piss People Off, do you automatically get the trilogy, Barry, or can you go book 1, see if you like it, then go to 2 and 3?
You can do that, but frankly, you do better if you just go in for everything.
Get the box set.
Get the box set. It's comes shrink wrapped, so you don't have to worry about any kind of white powder or anything being stuck in the books.
Wow, you put something in people's mind. I don't think anyone was going there until you said that. But the Reverend Barry Lynn, of course, great host, radio host. We got to know each other through the old KRXA 540 in Monterey when Barry hosted Culture Shocks for many years on that particular medium. Are you still doing Culture Shocks? I know you did for a while, but I assume you've pulled back, but you do any podcasting on your own now, Barry?
I don't do any more. I had a Culture Shocks podcast that went on for about a year. There were at the time over 1 million podcasts, and although I had a lot of fun doing it, I was not sure that they needed the 1 millionth and first podcast. But I had a great time, and I for a long time also did a segment with former comedian David Feldman, and we did something every Thursday night. And I had a chance to kind of invite people on that I would interview, and then David would interview at the end. And we really did some wonderful things, including talking to Bill Baird, who's really a forgotten figure in the reproductive justice movement. He's the guy who counter to the views even of Planned Parenthood at the time, went to the Supreme Court to get contraception for unmarried couples. I mean, it was easier to get married couples access, but then a lot of unmarried people said, well, why can't we get it? And most states said, you can't get it. And Bill was actually arrested in Massachusetts when he gave a lecture and passed out some contraceptives at the end of it. Had to go to the Supreme Court. The case is called Baird versus Eisenstadt.
When you think about how irrational those laws were, because they basically made it more likely that unmarried couples would have children than married couples, which, regardless of what your views are on that, it's not what the cultural right wants. It's not what the cultural conservatives want. The ones against contraception and any access, the last thing they claim to want is children born and raised out of wedlock.
No, absolutely. But there's not a lot of consistency in the right, as you and I both know. But the other thing, it's kind of like the effort for marriage equality. Alan Wilson, who did so much of this work, but even within the LGBTQ community, people said, don't do this because, I mean, go on for something like marriage. I mean, that's too controversial. We should go step by step by step. But he said no and brought the case that later became the Obergefell case that made same-sex marriage lawful throughout the United States. These are the great heroes that I really had a wonderful time meeting. One of the things about this book, I started writing this book, it had chapters just with people's names. And the first editor looked at this and said, you know, Barry, this is your book. It's not just about other people. But I think that most activists realize you cannot do much of anything by yourself. You have got to have a movement behind you, and you've got to make sure that you treat all the people in your circle with the respect that they deserve in order to get, among other things, to the goal, whether that's, you know, amnesty for war resistors or anti-censorship.
Ending the draft was a cause that you certainly embraced. The Reverend Barry Lynn with us on Halitics. By the way, click like, click subscribe, please. So hopefully we can get up to that magic number of 1,000 subscribers. Got a ways to go, but we'll get there. And if you want to join us, please give us a call. 240-242-5646. When we're live, obviously, is the only time that I'll be able to answer your calls. Barry, so many different issues to talk about. We don't have an unlimited amount of time, but just briefly focusing still on Paid to Piss People Off, do you recommend, you said it's best to just buy the trilogy in one fell swoop. Do you read it? Does it matter if you read it in order, peace, porn, prayer? Is there some kind of a theme that kind of develops over those books, or you can go in whatever order you like?
You can go in any direction, but I think if you read it linearly, one of the things that I grappled with, and that I had 4 editors work on this thing eventually, and there are things like, how do you use the media? How do you deal with celebrities that kind of transcend? I learned about it during my work on the amnesty movement, and then it developed over and over. And I did think it was important to find a way, and I think it works, to kind of go through these issues, not necessarily in chronological order, but to merge them together toward the end of each of these volumes. And the other thing is, I don't think that a lot of people who are celebrities really understand how important it is to work with nonprofit progressive groups. Because if you take a stand, if you have a commitment, and you're a celebrity and you want to do something, it can be an enormously important way to raise funds and to raise awareness of the issues. And I had the great pleasure of dealing with people. When I retired, I had a wonderful little retirement dinner in Washington. Louis Black, the comedian, emceed it, and Mary Gaucher sang at it. Jamie Raskin, who was my member of Congress at the time, spoke. Wade Henderson, the head of the campaign for human and civil rights, longtime advocate for racial justice. Everybody spoke. It was really a tremendous achievement. I really had a great time. 3 weeks later, I was in Indiana, Pennsylvania, having visiting my wife's mother, who was alive at the time, and we had a little Thanksgiving. And the next day, I found that I could not get out of bed, and I hurt. My left arm hurt because my wife is a doctor, and I said, "Let's go home," and she quite wisely said, "Let's go to an emergency room." And it turned out that I had a very serious heart condition, and in the beautiful healthcare system we have, it took me 3 days to get transferred from this little rural hospital to the Cleveland Clinic, one of the best heart places in the country. And they didn't do a perfect job. I lost my ability to speak for about 6 months, which was not a good thing, but I'd eventually found somebody, thanks to my connections in the folk music world. I ran into at a folk concert. She said, do you remember what I do? And I said, no. She said, well, I know you've been having some problems speaking, and I'm a speech therapist. And she worked with a lot of people. It was a miraculous achievement to get the voice back. But,
well, I would say so, Barry, because I mean, of course, I remember you before the stroke, and you're articulated beautifully. But you really, I mean, it's noticeable. You don't speak quite as crisply, but it's very, very you speak very, very well, as you always did. So I guess we should send a thank you letter to the speech therapist, if you haven't already done that.
Yeah, no, I've seen her many times, and since then, and if you go to that website, barrywlynn.com, you'll also see Louis Black, who I mentioned that was volunteered to be the MC at my retirement. But he asked me to do a little 6 or 7 minute thing at one of his concerts in Washington. And I had really had very limited voice, but I agreed to do it. He said, I don't care if you have to whisper, just do something. So I worked on a little 6 or 7 minute stand-up routine, and it's there.
Awesome.
In case people want to see it.
And I'm remiss. I haven't read the book yet. I just learned about it, and I haven't had a chance to get to it, but I will. Barry, do you feel like, and we talked about this before we started the stream, that maybe you didn't piss enough people off as we were lamenting throughout both of our lives, and you've got a couple of years on me, not that many, but a few. I think both of us have really, really tried to make things better, and it's hard for me to say with any conviction that things have gotten better. Maybe you've seen the civil rights movement, maybe you feel differently, but have we been effective? What can we do going forward to address the existential threats? And I don't think that's hyperbolic that we currently face.
No, it's not. And I think the most important thing is you can't give up. You can never give up. If you care about a principle, then you've got to keep working on it. You can't look at the trajectory of things and go, nothing will ever get any better. Because if you do that, and if you believe that, then it won't get any better. And I think that it's important for people to recognize that most people's beliefs are those that are held by the majority of the people, except not the majority of Congress. I mean, the Congress works, even Barack Obama. When Barack Obama finally decided marriage equality was something he would promote, he spent years trying to deny that. And he was a member of a United Church of Christ, a couple of United Church of Christ in Hawaii and in Chicago. And, I don't believe for a minute that he didn't know that marriage equality was the right legal and moral position. So even kind of the best we have presented ourselves with, they don't always have courage. One other thing, when I worked for the ACLU for a long time, and if I had $1 for every member of Congress who would say, well, I had a vote for this, Barry, I don't believe in it, but you guys, meaning the legal profession, you'll knock this out in court. That's not what you're supposed to do. If you're an elected official, you have an independent, legal, constitutional responsibility to do only those things that do not offend the Constitution. There are great members of Congress, but they're few and far between. And I mean, Jamie Raskin, who I mentioned, is a superb member of Congress. And Bobby Scott, African-American, who represents Richmond, one of the strongest preservers of separation of church and state in the entire Congress.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to get into an argument with you, but I do not appreciate Jamie Raskin as my representative for a number of reasons.
All right, well, that's okay.
We'll have to agree to disagree on that. But
we will.
I get it. I mean, a lot of people, a lot of progressives, people for whom I have great respect, such as yourself, have really admire Jamie and think he's done a tremendous job. I'm not one of those people. But that's interesting. So, but well, we don't have to get into that. Is he currently a rep? I thought you were in D.C. now. Is that not correct?
No, I'm in Massachusetts now.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Wow. So Jamie's not. One of the things he said when he spoke at my retirement dinner was that this was a hell of a time for me to leave because this was only 1 year into the Trump administration. Donald Trump, though, has become such a pariah. I mean, I don't understand how any human being who is remotely aware of what's going on could seriously be interested in returning Donald Trump to the presidency. But I do think that this leads to some very big mistakes being made by Democrats. I'll mention them.
Yeah, let's
Maybe.
talk about that. And I
Yeah.
want to get a clip in too, because you were very closely, obviously, associated with the separation of church and state movement as the
Sure.
exec director of United for Americans United for Separation of Church and State. But you did want to weigh in on the effort to block Trump from the ballot, which, as I understand, you do not think is well advised.
Yeah, I don't think it's a good idea. I mean, for a number of reasons, but I think the principal thing is what this argument of from the 14th Amendment, I simply don't think goes as far as the majority of the Supreme Court in Colorado or the Secretary of State in Maine have read it to be. I think it's much tougher. I think the argument that the Trump people are making has a certain amount of credibility. And I expect, frankly, that when this gets to the Supreme Court will say states don't have this power. But I also think that will be important because when the Supreme Court gets the question of is there total immunity for everything that the president does, is he immune from any kind of criminal liability for what happened on January 6th? I think the court, even though it is totally corrupted by members appointed by Donald Trump, I don't think they're going to go that far. I think they'll say, no, you can't be immune from everything, and see what happens. But, the courts in this country it's a sad situation because the Supreme Court, which I revered for a very long time, even though they didn't make every decision right. But I think now they've gotten to the point where it is essential that the court be expanded. And when I used to talk about that 4 years ago, even with progressives, they'd go, well, I don't think that's a good idea because if we add 3, then the Republicans will get back and then they'll add 5 more. This is the kind of thing, it's speculative concerns. I'd rather wait till we saw what was happening, make sure that we can correct these abominable decisions about guns, about church-state separation, and in general about voting rights.
Well, do you
This
think
is the whole ball game?
I mean, Barry, you picked some kind of hot button issues, guns, for example, which do divide Americans along within intra-class. They divide Americans within a class. And my goal, what I'm trying to push, one of the things is trying to unite people by class in support of economic issues like
Sure.
Medicare for all,
Sure.
affordable or debt-free education, and also end to wars. Are you concerned that by pushing for gun control measures, you make it more difficult for progressives to pass issues that reduce wealth and income inequality and address poverty?
Yeah, I don't think it does, but I also think you have to be very careful about bringing any gun issues to the federal courts. I mean, most of these have been corrupted by so many Republican appointees, and there are some Republican appointees who do great things, but in general, they're terrible. And I think the idea that you can take issues to the courts. On the gun issue, I used to be on the board for a few years of something called the National Coalition to Ban Handguns, which is what should happen. We should ban handguns. There's no reason to do it, notwithstanding the fact that Fox News and other right-wing sources do have 1 or 2 examples of somebody who had defended their home against a marauder and not just shoot somebody by accident. But the decision made a couple years ago about open carrying concealed weapons in New York City were based on the premise that you can't make decisions based on what's happening now. You have to look back 200 years and try to figure out what was the intent. The 2 stupidest ways to make judicial decisions are something called constitutional originalism, as if you could easily figure that out, and Bible literalism, which is another crazy thing. I mean, I do a sermon occasionally that talk about these two terrible ways to make decisions about what the Constitution really means and what the governance of the United States should be. And I think even in the church-state arena, we have to be very careful about bringing cases that could result in terrible.
Well, you have to be strategic, no question.
You have to be very strategic. The civil rights movement was strategic.
It was.
But
they also, Barry, had the justices who were prepared to, say yes in Brown versus Board of Education and other critical cases. We're talking to Barry Lynn. He has written Memoirs. It's a trilogy, and that's you can get it at barrywlynn.com. And we're going to talk a little bit more about church and state separation. Barry, I just wanted to though focus a little bit more on what you talked about, the 14.3 cases in both Colorado and the Supreme Court there and the Secretary of State of Maine have ruled that Trump is blocked from the ballot, although they've stayed. At least the Supreme Court decision was stayed. It's not clear to me what's happening in Maine. It's been appealed to the Supreme Court of Maine. Is it do you feel like these are ill-advised because they're ultimately not going to prevail at the Supreme Court because you think that the law doesn't really support them? Or do you have a problem with the politics, that it doesn't look good? And to be fair to the Democrats, they're not really necessarily pushing these. Yes, Jamie Raskin led the impeachment efforts after Trump was out of office. But right now it's these nonprofits, Crew, and Free Speech for People, I believe, that are most associated with getting Trump off the ballot. Do you have a problem with the strategy in terms of whether the optics, it doesn't look good, it could negatively impact on the Democrats because people don't like it, or because you think it's not going to win, or both?
I think it's both, Hal. I mean, I think that the optics are terrible because the idea that he's promoting, and all of his lawyers are promoting, is that they're trying to stop me from even having a chance to run against Joe Biden. And it's crazy. That is not what they're trying to do. And Crew and these other groups that you mentioned, I mean, I have a lot of respect for them in general, but I just think this is the wrong strategy. And I think it's a very weak constitutional argument to say that you don't have to have Congress do anything, that you can simply, this is a kind of a self-actualizing prohibition and you can determine what an insurrection is. I don't think it's a very strong argument. And I think in this court, the Supreme Court is a losing argument. But the other thing that's even worse is what's going on in New Hampshire. And that's where Democrats, first of all, they tried briefly before it became too late to change your party denomination, but which was sometime in October. But now there are people spending a vast amount of money to go to the nearly 1/3 of New Hampshire voters who do not characterize themselves as Republicans or Democrats. They're independents and they can vote for anyone. And they're trying to get people to vote in the Republican primary.
For Nikki Haley,
For Nikki Haley. Yeah. And I'll tell you something. Nikki Haley is the only person who could potentially defeat Joe Biden. Donald Trump, we have a shot at defeating him because he's crazy, and more people are going to notice that. And if he gets convicted between now and Election Day, even more people say they will not vote for him. Nikki Haley she's smart, she's clever, and she's a liar. And she's just as bad politically as Donald Trump on every issue, on LGBTQ issues, on abortion rights. She says, let's find some way to come together on abortion. When she was a South Carolina legislator, she supported the most extreme measures to keep reproductive justice from happening in the state. And She has even said that if, as president, she got a 6-week ban on abortion, she'd sign it. So much for the fact that she's willing to negotiate. When push comes to shove, she is just as extreme as Trump or the Satanist or any of the other people that are running it.
Well, do you think that the reason, and I've talked about this a little bit, Barry, do you think part of the reason that especially, true elites in the Democratic Party, there's a slide up I was able to furiously scramble to find, like the billionaire Jamie Dimon, a fraudster, by the way, a guy who's clearly committed many fraudulent acts to line the pockets of his bank, J.P. Morgan, and of course himself more than anything else. He supports Nikki Haley. Do you think it's because he'd be perfectly happy if Nikki Haley were president? And Trump's more of a wild card. Trump every now and then does do some things that the billionaire elites don't particularly like. He did get us out of Afghanistan. That cost them, the weapons manufacturers, money. He did impose tariffs that did cost the importers and the offshorers money. You don't have to worry about that with Nikki Haley, the woman who can't even say that the cause of the Civil War was slavery, because exploiting labor is something that both Jamie Dimon and Nikki Haley extol.
Of course they do. And I think that, but you're onto something. Yes, there are some things that Trump does that affect the highest class of earners. But she is just as bad. Does anybody seriously think that Nikki Haley, who now argues that Joe Biden's too old, we can talk about that if you want, but I think it's nonsense to believe that Nikki Haley is not going to be able to, if she runs, I don't believe she's 17 points ahead like the Wall Street Journal poll of a few weeks ago. But she's clearly ahead. She's been ahead. She's been the only Republican candidate who has beaten Trump for months since her entry into the race. People will say, yeah, we'll vote for her. We don't want to vote for her. And I think if Donald Trump is the candidate, there's the one and only chance Democrats have to keep Biden in office. And it's not the only thing he has to worry about. I was, I voted for third-party candidates in my early life, particularly when it didn't seem that it made much difference in the state I was living in, who I voted for. But I'm very concerned about Jill Stein, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Dean Phillips, Marianne Williamson, and the possibility that Cornel West, who I've known off and on for years. I don't think third parties, this is too important an election. And I know everybody always says this is the most important election of our lifetime. But I think this one is, because if Donald Trump or Nikki Haley becomes the president of the United States, they will bring in all kinds of more Senate Republicans who you don't get to be a Senate Republican running now unless you are a strong MAGA supporter. You don't get through the primaries. And the House, I think, is fragile. In New York, California, a couple of other states, Democrats will pick up a couple of seats, but man, it's too risky.
Barry, to push back on that, how do we change the Democratic Party, which we both agree is a major part of the problem?
Sure.
How can we possibly change it if every time there's a threat to the election of a corporate pro-war Democrat like Joe Biden, progressives circle the wagons around him and say, well, we may not love Joe Biden, but the alternative is that much worse? What incentive could there ever be for the Democratic Party elites to change if they know they can count on support from left to right across the Democratic Party spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a definite problem, but I don't think that this is the time to test it. This is not, even in 1972, there was a Peace and Freedom Party candidate, a African American woman from New York, and I even supported her over George McGovern. I didn't know McGovern much at the time. I came to know him better afterwards, but I just thought, here is a real challenger. Here is somebody who can make a difference, who is already saying the right thing. In California, Adam Schiff, I assume, is going to end up being the Democratic nominee, but Barbara Lee is a much better progressive. I mean, she's one of the few people who opposed our interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. And she, she's just a better candidate. And I think that if people look at the possibility of changing these elections locally, and then develop a bench of people who can actually go and run for higher office and be electable. I think that's what we need to do, because these third-party candidates, much as, I love Cornel West. I mean, when I read Race Matters, back in 1983, it was an extraordinary volume. He was one of my debate partners on the very first William F. Buckley special that I did. And, he's a powerful speaker. He's a person who understands the difference between a theocracy and a democracy. But he ain't going to win the election. If you looked at every political issue that he has taken on, Marianne Williamson the same way. She's great on peace. She wants to do the right thing. She wants to have a Department of Peace. These are great ideas, but she just is not. I mean, it's easy to take Marianne Williamson to task and say, well, she's just kind of a new age guru, or, Oprah likes her and that's the only thing she has going for her. That's not the only thing. But I just don't think that this is the time for her to decide maybe to siphon off 1 or 2% as a vote. Because if you end up with Donald Trump or Nikki Haley, a Republican Senate and a Republican House, you have destroyed America. It will not recover from that kind of constellation of idiocies.
The Reverend Barry Lynn with us on Halitics. So appreciate his presence, your presence. Thanks so much, Barry. I'm going to play that clip you can see from the Washington Post in a moment. Also, really appreciate your coming on. I know you've been on some other programs, including Tom Hartman's, some other bigger names in the progressive universe. So it's really, I have to say, a coup for me to have you. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Folks want to join 240-242-5646. And because of your, association with the separation of church and state movement, I did want to play this clip. This is a church in South Carolina where an African American church where President Biden was speaking, and I thought this clip was of some instructive nature. I wanted your take on it, and specifically on whether Biden should be there. But let's play the clip first.
Sure.
Without the truth, there's no light. Without light, there's no path from this darkness.
If you really care about the lives lost here, then you should honor the lives lost and call for a ceasefire in Palestine. Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now!
That's all right. That's all right. That's all right. That's all right.
All right, so you get the sense there, Barry. I won't play all of it, but very clearly he's speaking at this African American church, I think in Charleston. I could be wrong about the location. He's right there with Jim Clyburn, very powerful House Democrat. Do you approve of presidents and presidential candidates campaigning in churches, first of all?
Yeah, no, in general, I don't. I think this was a slightly different thing in that it was at the site of the Charleston massacre of parishioners just a few years ago. So I think he did want to make a statement about race. He wanted to make it clear. And Jim Clyburn is an extraordinarily powerful person. He's got the capacity, and I think it is a correct statement that but for Jim Clyburn in the last presidential cycle endorsing Biden in South Carolina, Biden might not even be the president of the United States. So, but what I do object to is when candidates go to these places and then expect them to endorse him as an institution. The Internal Revenue Service is absolutely clear that you cannot endorse any candidate for any political office if you are a tax-exempt organization, including if you're a church. And although Donald Trump said he was going to do away with that provision, he never actually did that. But I'm embarrassed that Barack Obama, Joe Biden, they are not going after these churches that are spending an enormous amount of money to defeat candidates or to support somebody like Donald Trump. The law is clear. The law is, we filed at Americans United the very first challenge to a church that had endorsed a candidate. They took out a full-page ad in USA Today that said you shouldn't vote for Bill Clinton because Bill Clinton is a sinner. And the rest of the ad had proof texts from the Bible of all the things that you were not supposed to do that Clinton did. And then at the bottom it said, and if you vote for a sinner, you too are a sinner, with another proof text from the Bible. And we challenged that, and we were successful, and they did lose their tax exemption. That was the first time in history that anybody had lost it. And they had some very clever lawyers who thought, we better not go to the Supreme Court. They ended with the DC Circuit. And, frankly, what happened in that case was the church, called the Church at Pierce Creek, which ironically at the time was the church of Randall Terry, the anti-choice zealot. They just closed their doors and set up a new church so they could continue to do the same thing. But this should not happen. And the fact that it's not being taken seriously by Democrats, including Biden, is shocking. I mean, I know that what they say is, oh, we don't want to get people upset. We don't want to upset the religious community. Well,
we don't want to piss them off. We don't want to piss them off. Barry.
Yeah, because that's my job and your job. It's not the. But I mean, but what you saw there also was a wise thing. Here are people in the midst of this calling him out for being irresponsible when it comes to developing a policy on the Hamas-Israel war. And so they did escort him out and all of that. But I think that's a good idea too.
So you don't have any problem. I mean, I put the quote up there from Simone Sanders. She had previously worked for Bernie Sanders, I believe, in 2016. Then she crossed the picket line, if you will, and worked for Biden in 2020. And they are carrying water for the presidency, going after the ralliers or the protesters. You don't buy what she's selling there. Is that right? Even though you support Biden, you want him to win, you have no truck with those claiming that this church should be exempt from a rally or protest against the war in Gaza.
No, I don't think so. And one of the things about what's going on in the Middle East now, and I'm not Jared Kushner, so I'm not an expert on this, but one of the things that I think needs to be examined on cable television, on talk radio, is what is the standard for considering an effort to how do you know if somebody has crossed the line? Most people in this country, if you ask them, how do you determine whether a war is justified? They'll say something that amounts to their own or an adopted view of what is a just war. Just war theory is central, not just to the Roman Catholic Church, but they have a very clear line of looking at issues. One issue is whether the response is justified by what has happened. It's a proportionality argument. And most Protestant churches, Jewish organizations have a similar thing, and proportionality is always a part of it. I have never seen a discussion on television or heard one on radio about what is a just war. What is the proportionality? I don't believe, by the way, that Hamas is telling us the truth about that they know exactly how many children have been killed. But clearly there have been a huge amount of destruction in Gaza of Palestinians who have nothing to do with Hamas. But there's no discussion of that. I mean, before you can even begin to look at what the solution is, I think the solution has got to be one in which you examine the underlying issues. And, television, because I'm retired, I probably watch more television than I used to. But it's pathetic. The coverage of this is the same with Ukraine. CNN is absolutely convinced that Zelensky will win. I'm not convinced.
Well, they're paid to, right? I mean, they get a lot of money from the mic. I mean, they're sponsored by weapons manufacturers and the oil and gas industry. So they don't want to buck their milk cows. Let me ask you this, just stick with Israel and Palestine for a little bit, and I just put that image up there. Is this the dangers of theocracy? Your career has been in significant part, not solely or even maybe, I don't know, I haven't tracked it that closely, but obviously a very significant time and effort spent on keeping religion separate from government. Is what we're seeing in Gaza the poisonous fruits of a theocracy where government and religion are intertwined as they are in Israel?
Yeah, there's no question about that. And the other thing about these religious differences is if you start with a religious premise, as the Jewish community does about Israel, they go back to the Bible. They say, this is the land God gave us. Then you encrust onto that all kinds of political arguments. You have the worst of both worlds. You have a religious theocracy claim, and you also have a political claim that doesn't seem to ever recognize that Palestine needs a separate state. There is no solution, I'm convinced, unless there is a two-state solution, which is something Jimmy Carter tried to push, that Netanyahu clearly opposes. And I don't see any resolution of that short of either killing everyone associated with Hamas, making sure that you haven't created a whole new generation of anti-Israeli Palestinians because of the damage you've done in Gaza. We've got to come up with that, and politicians do not want to talk about it. I mean, here in Massachusetts, we've got 2 Democratic senators. They're very reluctant to suggest anything that might be viewed as pro-Palestinian.
It's very, very upsetting. I mean, there's simply no willingness to separate in any way meaningfully from the Netanyahu government, which is extremely unpopular, as a matter of fact, in Israel.
Sure it is.
And I think this is one of the reasons, and I have a lot of trouble committing to vote for Joe Biden, and I've actually not committed to vote for him because of that very reason. I mean, this is a genocide, as I see it, against a people, and the only way to stop it, short of, I guess, some sort of revolution in Israel, or at least a coup getting Netanyahu out of power, is for the U.S. government to stop supporting Israel. And that is something that we under Biden will not do. Now, the problem with my argument is that Nikki Haley and Trump are even worse on this issue.
Yes, they certainly are. And, you know, we're kind of out of time, but the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, this guy is the worst human being to serve in the Congress. Why? Because he admits that he's a Christian nationalist. There's no wondering about it. He worked for the Alliance Defending Freedom, which Americans United, we litigated against them a lot. We did a lot of radio and television interviews about that. And Mike Johnson was one of their key litigators. And here is a guy who barely makes it to be Speaker and may not survive the next round of discussions over the budget. But Democrats voted to keep the government open. Only two Democrats didn't vote for it. Everybody else did. A handful of Republicans did. And I think this is a huge mistake. You do not give solace to, support to, and turn into a hero this Mike Johnson, who is a Christian nationalist. When I say that, I mean, he's a man who, in his very first television interview after becoming Speaker, he talks to Sean Hannity, and Hannity says, well, how do people understand what your worldview is? And he says, well, go to your bookshelf, pick up a Bible, and read it, and then you'll know what my worldview is. You know, very few people actually do that. I was on Bill O'Reilly's show before he was loofed, and I don't know what he's doing now. But he said, well, what's one member of the Congress that you think is a Christian nationalist? And I said, John Cornyn of Texas. And O'Reilly didn't really push back on that. It was like, okay. But this guy is an affirmed, confirmed, and proud Christian nationalist. Abortion shouldn't exist. It shouldn't exist. Rape, incest, forget those exceptions. Place like Nikki Haley did when she was in the South Carolina legislature. They don't even want that. They don't care about that. And as Barney Frank used to say, the congressman from Massachusetts, these are people who are pro-life until the moment of birth, and then they don't care anymore. And that's exactly what's happened. And even with, you know, we both want to dramatically change the healthcare system. We've got a healthcare system, a Medicare system, which I'm in. And frankly, it's okay, but it ain't perfect. Why, for example, are they willing to support payment for $1 million drug that may or may not be effective on Parkinson's disease, but not cover hearing aids, not cover glasses? These are the things that people need. If you ask an audience of elderly people, what do they want? They want hearing aids and they want glasses. They do not want somebody to spend
dental care.
$500,000.
Dental care also.
Dental care. That's another thing. I mean, dental care is, when I used to travel around for Americans United, I'd meet people in my age group, which was then, 60-ish. And everybody wanted the same thing. They loved the idea of Medicare. Do you know that even Jay Sekulow, who was, of course, a right-wing lawyer, very clever guy, though, and the last debate we did was at University of Pennsylvania, and in the midst of a discussion, he said, I don't see why people are against Medicare for all. He said, this makes complete sense. And people
I don't really think people are. It's the legislators who are, because they're paid large amounts of money into their reelection campaigns. And perhaps even worse, Barron, you can weigh in on this real quick, and then I want to get to one quick topic before we leave.
Sure, absolutely.
They also are looking at that golden parachute when they leave Congress. Howard Dean getting $1 million a year from the for-profit pharmaceutical industry to fight against Medicare for all. Same with Gephardt. Dick Gephardt was one of the most highly paid pro-profit lobbyists, pro-healthcare profit lobbyists around. These are Democrats.
Absolutely, and they know what's happening, and that very few people leave Congress and then decide they're going to go back home. They almost never do. One of the few people that did was Congressman Pat Williams of Montana, who was a genuine progressive, who really worked very hard decade and a half ago to find a way to open public schools for daycare before and after school. And this is a huge issue. I opposed one of the other things that happens. We give so much money to churches now. We shouldn't be giving a dime to churches. We shouldn't repair churches with tax dollars. We shouldn't do anything. If you have a church, then it's your responsibility to figure out how to fix it, not come to the taxpayers and say, "Oh yeah, please fix it." And but Pat was strongly against it, and this idea of having childcare in religious institutions, he knew, as I did and most people do, the only reason you set up a school related to your church is to try to make sure that the kids go home and say to their parents, "Oh, I had such a great time at school today. Why don't you come with me at church?" And the pastor's going to call the parents and say, "Come on, worship with me." And
Ooh. We froze you,
ironically,
you lost you for just a second.
Liberal. Oh, yeah. I mean, the Children's Defense Fund was a big proponent of opening up churches to schools and church schools to be paid for with tax dollars, and I thought that was just a horrible idea. As did people like Bobby Scott, I mentioned, and Don Edwards, who was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee at the time. And it was a real fight between liberals and liberals, progressives and progressives, and it ended up doing nothing. The child care system in this country is as broken today as it was 25 years ago.
Barry, what do you? This is going to be your open-ended question, and we'll close out after. But again, why I do this, and I think why you did what you do is try to make things better, try to make change. Do you have do you have kind of a thumbnail sketch or a way to make things better? Presumably your memoirs. Is there like a I don't know, something that people can grasp onto? Because I think we look around, we look at the No More Winters, we look at the slaughter in Ukraine that's endless, the killing people in Gaza for no reason, not even no good, just
none,
pointless slaughter. What do we do? What can we do?
I mean, I think, first of all, one of the things that's generally not worth doing is attempting to take the MAGA people, meet with them, talk to them, and see if you can change their mind. Although it does, again, if you go to my website, there's an interesting interview I did with the Reverend Rob Schenck, who is a leader, one of the cleverest people in the anti-choice movement. He's the guy who testified in Congress about how he doesn't approve of this anymore, he would link high Republican donors with Supreme Court justices. And he did it for years and years and years. And now he's completely repudiated it. And in that, there's an interview I did with him on the barrywlynn.com. He changed his life. I mean, he says to me, I should have listened to you 30 years ago, but I didn't. I was mainly on the wrong side. You were mainly right, and I was mainly wrong. So you have those iconic changes in position. But when it comes to the average, you can't go to an abortion clinic, a women's health clinic that does abortions, and talk to the protesters and expect them to just go, "Oh, I never thought of that." But there are plenty of people in the middle that have to be I don't like political action committees except one. There's one called the Movement Voters Project. And an actor named Ethan Hirschenfeld and I have done 2 fundraisers for them, both when Raphael Warnock was, in a runoff for the Senate seat in Georgia. And, there are plenty of people who need to be told, hey, this is how you vote. This is how you can vote. You need to make sure that those people get the doors knocked on in that week before the election so that they have a couple days to figure out how to go and vote. And similarly, there are groups that are hiring cabs and Ubers to take people to polling places. I don't think the average person understands how difficult it is to get around. You don't have a car. Maybe it's a mile. You're in a walker. You don't have, you need help. And there are people that are working to make sure that people get to the polls. So you need to register voters, step number 1. Second, and more important, you need to get them to the polls. This is not rocket science, but it's something people just, I don't know, no, we don't have time for that. You have to have time. If Joe Biden is the president, or is the candidate, as I expect he will be, he's going to need all the help he can get.
All right, Jeff, Barry, thanks so much. Really, what an honor to have you on. Greatly appreciated.
Love to do it. Thank you.
Absolutely. And you can click on barrywlynn.com for much more information. Appreciate you as well, watching, listening. I'll be back tomorrow. Have a great day.